and welcome to The Conversation, the podcast. My name is Happy Crater, and my guest today is Mo Dhaliwal, who is an entrepreneur, a cultural producer, and a public speaker. Welcome, Mo.
Thanks for having me.
I'd just like to dive right in and learn about your relationship with your faith.
Yeah, so it's an interesting path. My family, my faith is from the Sikh religion, and the Sikh faith is something that I was kind of born into culturally, but I don't think I necessarily formed a relationship until maybe my early 30s. So it was the sort of thing where I knew that me and my family were Sikh. We attended the gurdwaras, various Sikh functions that were related to marriages and birth, death, marriage, that whole cycle. And it wasn't until my early 30s that I kind of happened upon some people that were doing some work at this organization called the Sikh Research Institute. That then it kind of sparked my curiosity again, and I started learning more about what it meant to be a Sikh, and actually reflecting back on my 30 years of life up to that point, to understand where some of those values perhaps might have already been showing up, and where I might not have recognized where my Sikh background had actually influenced some of my choices in life.
And so what were some of those values that attracted you or solidified for you, or however you would describe that?
So the major tenets of Sikh, Sikhi as we call it, is remembrance of basically the Creator, right? Remembrance of the creative force that sort of permeates the whole universe of which we're a part. Then it's of doing good works, right? So living an honest life, and lastly, being in service to humanity. And so I think that most Sikhs are probably at different points of the spectrum on all three levels. Mm-hmm. There's many, I think, that live it quite beautifully and completely in remembrance and in service and living an honest life. And for myself, it actually really showed up in a lot of my community and social justice work. I was doing a lot of work sort of throughout my life in trying to create space for others in issues related to racial or economic justice. I tended to get involved, and I think I was inspired by some of the stories that I had been told maybe as a child of some of the heroes that come out of the Sikh stories and the histories actually of our 10 gurus. And those are very inspiring stories, right? So I think in the social justice side, I think it played out a little bit better. The places where I'm not so great are in, remaining in remembrance of the creative force. I'm not fantastic at that. I try to live a pretty honest life, but when it comes to things that are related to social justice, I think that's most of where my Sikhi shows up personally.
Okay,
yeah.
So those spiritual values manifest themselves in these actions for justice. Mm-hmm. I'm really interested in these stories that have inspired you. Mm-hmm. Is there one story or another that you remember that resonated in childhood that you kind of carry with you as you move through the world now, as both someone who helps people with their creative endeavors and who's fighting for economic and social and racial justice? Mm-hmm.
I don't think there was any one specific story, but I do remember one thing, as a child, discovering these sort of almost like comic books that were in English and that were actually written about the various battles that were fought by the Sikhs of the time, 300 to 400 years ago. And the thing that I think even back then dawned on me as being quite different was that, this is in parallel to me growing up with, cartoons, right? Mm-hmm. Very young age. And in cartoons, there's a very, sort of binary, light versus dark, good versus evil. There's a very, binary way of looking at these things. And what I found in some of the earliest stories that I read was the generosity, the love, and the accommodation that was actually even shown to, he who was the enemy, right? Mm. So there'd be the battles between, the Sikh warriors and the Mughals, as an example. And it wasn't like the ultimate defeat of the Mughals was like the end goal, right? It was to defeat the oppression, but to still recognize the humanity that existed within them, and to actually still in many ways, shower even the enemy with love and generosity while you're actually dismantling their oppressive empire.
A moment ago, you talked about in sort of like this kind of three principal modes of Sikh, of remembering the Creator and help me. What were the other two?
Living an honest life.
Living an honest
honestly,
life,
yeah.
and service to humanity.
Mm-hmm.
But you said that the area you struggle with is remembrance of the Creator.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in what that means to you. What does remembrance of the Creator look like,
mm-hmm.
and how is it that you struggle with it?
I think I'm a very colonized mind, right? So the capitalistic tendencies, flow through me for sure. So I think I just don't take enough time to be present, to meditate on my life, to meditate on the lives of others, and to understand and remind myself actually that I need to have compassion for myself, and through that have compassion for others, because in fact there is no other, right? We're all a part of that same unifying force that permeates the whole universe. And so the idea that we're all drops from the ocean, but the ocean's also in the drop. Mm-hmm. The few times that I give myself enough pause and space to think about that and reflect, I find a lot of value in it. But just in the life that I lead, and some of the patterns I have with work and what have you, you find every excuse in the book to not do that. But it's definitely meant to be a starting point.
Right. Okay, I got it. So it's like a foundation in mm-hmm. remembering that actually is how you said it is so beautiful, right? There mm-hmm. is no other. Mm-hmm. We're all manifestations of that same creative force mm-hmm. in some sense, or we're all God's children, some people might say. Mm-hmm. That if that's the principle upon which you build the other efforts of your life, then that's a solid foundation.
Yeah.
So I'm also interested in how Sikhism informs your confrontation with adversity, whether it's personal mm-hmm. or professional, or it's in the realm of the justice work that you do.
Mm-hmm. A link that I made later in life was around this concept of Chardi Kala. And Chardi Kala is loosely translated. There's no...
How do I... Teach me to say that word.
Yeah, it's Chardi.
Back we
gotta roll the R's, gotta roll the D's.
Chardi
Kala.
Chardi Kala.
Kala, yeah, with a K.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the idea of Chardi Kala, I mean, there's no perfect translation for it, but loosely translated, it's this idea of a rising spirit, and to maintain a sort of internal state of optimism. And there's sort of a worldview captured within that optimism as well, because on a sunny day when things are going well, it's easy to be optimistic. But the idea here is to be optimistic and remaining in rising spirits perpetually, even when, and invoking the story of some of our Sikh gurus, even when your family is being killed, right? Even when the oppressor has decimated vast swaths of your armies, right? When your lands have been taken from you, is that even in those moments to continue fighting for what's right, continue doing what's true to you, and maintaining those rising spirits and understanding that this is all a part of life. And I think I maintained a pretty, eternal sort of optimism for sure. And it's a good reminder as well, when things aren't going well, is that that's actually the time to be in remembrance of the Creator, and to be thinking about the fact that life is playing out as it should, and your rising spirits, your Chardi Kala, needs to be embraced at those points as much as any other point.
Yeah, there's a power in equanimity, isn't mm-hmm. there? Mm-hmm. Like it's, we hear the enraged voices, and they're important voices because they're reacting to something important. But there's something about that peaceful space of equanimity that transmits a sort of a love or a kind of a faith that we're moving through this. We're moving through this together, and I find that really encouraging when I encounter it.
Yeah.
I also wanted. I'm interested in what is the experience, or what are your reflections on being a person of faith, and in which is a broad category, and then more specifically being Sikh in a secular country and culture, in a multi-faith context like we have here in Canada, not to mention a colonial legacy as well.
I think Canada is largely like secular in advertising, mostly. The default is it's this was a Christian nation, right? And it was meant to be one for a long time, and so I think it's been the effect of actually Aboriginal attitudes, Indigenous attitudes, and belief systems and values that maybe this sort of Canadian experiment couldn't help but be affected by, actually. And it was those values of expanding the circle and welcoming and finding space for others, and broadening the circle when others show up, and broadening the circle when even more show up. I think we couldn't help but be affected by those values, which has kind of led to this moment where we're starting to think of Canada as being a secular nation. But when I talk about the fact that I kind of arrived at Sikhi later in life, and even then, I seldom claim the space that I am a Sikh necessarily, because I feel like I'm still on a journey, I'm still on a path towards learning what that means to me. But when I was in early elementary school, I read from the Bible in front of the class. I to this day know many Christian hymns. Actually, I shouldn't say many, a few Christian hymns. Better than I do, much of Sikh scripture or poetry, right? And that's kind of because just the repetition of it was, like kindergarten to grade 4. It was like we just got a lot of that. Right?
You and I must be about the same age, because I can still, because I think they took the Lord's Prayer, ended all of a sudden in grade 5. We weren't saying it.
Yeah, that's. I think it was grade 5 for me too, actually.
Yeah.
So without dating ourselves too much, we'll just leave it at that. But I think, and if that was in our generation, right, then that wasn't too long ago, actually, when you think about it. So I think the sort of exploration of Canada as a secular country needs to be sort of, the other bookend of that is that it was actually a Christian white supremacist nation at its outset, right? And we have to address that. That's just what it was. And now that we're moving towards wanting to be this secular place that creates a lot of inclusion and room for all these voices and the marginalized and real and true equity, that then we actually understand that even the opportunity to do that was kind of afforded by, it's my belief, by value systems that were inherently Indigenous.
So, in other words, there's something about the Indigenous roots, even of the country we call Canada, which obviously predate long before the country we now call Canada started to build itself on Indigenous land. But that there's those spirits and traditions still inform how you situate yourself in this multicultural, multi-faith nation. Is that about right?
Absolutely. This is an idea that was put forth by this Canadian philosopher, John Wollstonecraft Saul. And, on paper, our multiculturalism policy isn't that different than other nations around the world, right? But there's countries that, declared their multiculturalism to be a total, abject failure for various reasons. So what was it that, caused it to work even as much as it did, right? By no means am I a proponent of multiculturalism. I think that as well is a very dated and problematic idea.
I'm interested in hearing more about that.
That's a whole other conversation.
Okay, well, just continue with what you're saying, and if there's time, we'll jump back to
for sure
what's wrong with multiculturalism.
Yeah, for sure. But I think the context that allowed it to work even as well as it did, I think, is the fact that we couldn't help but be influenced by the Indigenous people of this land.
So in terms of those Indigenous values and that spirit that runs through this country, and that you have said, you have felt like has informed us all along. How do you see that playing out from today forward?
I think that one's a bit difficult for me to answer because I can't speak on behalf of our First Nations. But what I can say is that leading up to this moment, it's become more than apparent that the whole history was never told, right? That the amount of interaction and influence and actually generosity that was experienced by colonizers, that's been kind of, washed away and kind of erased from our history, right? So the full influence is only starting to be realized. As far as what we do moving forward, I think our Indigenous communities are, really finding a lot of momentum in finding a voice with a larger Canadian society, even though they continue to face, oppression and resistance and injustice at the hands of, everything from the RCMP to the way the Canadian government continues to deal with everything from land to water rights and access.
I'm interested in, often the sort of colonial project is framed as the European colonization of Indigenous lands here in Canada. And now you are of a tradition, and I presume a family from Asia, India, or some other, or where is your family from?
India. Yeah.
India, right. Mm-hmm. So in the narrative of the Canadian colonial project, how do you see yourself fitting into this history?
I think to be a good citizen, and I try to be, fitting in is by invoking some of the things that I'm invoking, right? Unfortunately, there's many members of my community, and I think other communities as well, that are settlers, and we actually wind up propagating, almost like tacitly propagating, the colonization and erasure that happened for generations before, right? Like growing up in a small town like Abbotsford, right? It was, easier to kind of align with the dominant narratives, right, around, who the First Nations people are, who we are, what society is supposed to look like, and what it should be, right? And our society continues to reward that, right? It's like if you align yourself with this sort of Western civilization way of being, and this narrative around capitalism and economies and how these things are supposed to work, then you're rewarded for that, right? And I think that if you're a non-white settler in a place like Canada, it's important, as you're fighting for rights and justice for yourself, that you also understand that you don't have any legitimacy unless you actually have a relationship with the First Nations people, unless you have an understanding of their history and their rights and who they are, and are able to locate yourself within that before you take a step beyond that.
Multiculturalism, is it problematic, and how?
It's like something that I think we should be endeavoring to evolve beyond, right? Viewing it today, and this is coming, like I was the province's chair of multiculturalism for a while, right? Reporting into the Minister of State on multiculturalism. And, we chaired a council, and I was a part of this group for, I think, about 6 years. And in my last couple of years, I was starting to realize that, really what we were trying to say was that there were people that weren't included, would never be included, and they needed to be, right? That in order to have equity and justice in society, you need to make sure that you're actively including these voices somehow. And that had very little to do with, what country you quote unquote came from, or, immigration or anything like that. And what was interesting was that a lot of multiculturalism gets, couched in language around immigration, right? Without understanding that discrimination can take place without immigration ever, being a part of the equation, right? So I think it's a pretty dated principle for today, right? It's a little paternalistic, and I still think that it places white power structures at the center of doling out, this sort of inclusion, doling out this multiculturalism.
Saying who really gets to be included, whose culture is included in this multicultural.
Absolutely, yeah. Right. So I think in dismantling that, we need some new, further evolved sort of diversity and inclusion initiative that actually is about understanding who's marginalized and who has been treated unjustly, right? And then it doesn't matter if it's race, religion. It could have to do with, physical or mental abilities. It could happen to, be related to where you fall on the gender spectrum, right? There's so many ways, frankly, that we have of like hurting and marginalizing people, right? That we kind of need to look at that spectrum and say, how do we bring equity to this equation?
And would it be appropriate to ask ourselves a question: how do we empower the most vulnerable, or the most forgotten, or the most dispossessed of amongst us? I mean, that's sort of part of some of what I ask myself in my work on the streets. Is like I'm engaged, obviously, with super marginalized population, right? And some of it is racial or cultural, because there's Indigenous people are disproportionately represented in street life. But it's also like, if you're an injection drug user, that's another that's another marginalized group. And so, what's in my heart is I want to see each of us empowered and loved, and in a state where we can thrive.
Yeah, I mean, empowerment is one thing for sure, and I think that's necessary, regardless, because again, otherwise we run the risk of kind of paternalistically telling somebody who and what they are, what sort of help they need. But one thing that's sometimes missing from this, and I know it was missing in our conversations around multiculturalism for sure, was when we're talking about just even communities, right, be they cultural or religious, and wanting to be a part of this sort of Canadian fabric. Seldom did anybody ask the question of, what are you willing to give up to see that happen, right? Because it was always just additive, right? It was like, everybody's just going to keep, adding to this thing.
There's like this perpetual growth kind of principle, right?
Yeah. Without addressing the fact that actually the bones of this system, like the foundation of it, is fundamentally unjust, and to achieve the state that we're after, like something's got to give.
Okay. Right. So if I'm getting what you're saying, it's not just about, like, the reason equity is maybe more the word that you gravitate towards rather than empowerment is because empowerment doesn't address really like who's got to share or sacrifice, or
absolutely,
as opposed to equity.
To some extent, it kind of thrusts the burden of labor, right, onto whoever that minority is, right, to show up as a model again, right? Be this thing because we've empowered you, and that's the way that we want you to exist, as opposed to looking at what systems might have been created that actually thrust you to the outside in the first place.
Circling back to the role of your faith, I'm also interested in how your faith helps you discover your sense of purpose or imbue your life with meaning. That sort of helps answer the question, why am I here?
Yeah. So I think in the Sikh perspective, that was actually a bit of a moment of empowerment for me, when I think lifelong kind of had some suspicions about what I thought, the Sikh faith was about. And when I got a little bit closer to it, thankfully, some of what I thought was there, was born true. And one of those things was, there's no real dichotomy of good and bad, right? There's no sin, right? There's no, or at least there's not meant to be this sort of ideal that you're trying to approach but can never really arrive at, right? And because there's no good and bad, framework around, how you sort of address yourself as the individual, the idea is that you're supposed to put yourself on a path, right? Put yourself on your own path. And it's not to say that there's one path that's the good way, and then if you're not on the one path, you're wrong. It's to say that you need to figure out what that path means for you, and whatever stage you're at isn't really the point. If you're walking the path for yourself at any stage, then you're a Sikh. And for me, there was a lot of inclusion in that. And I find that when you're able to find acceptance and inclusion for yourself, you're more likely to actually be accepting and including of others. And it gave me, a lot of freedom and empowerment to know that I'm on my own path, and it's up to me to figure out what that means to me.
Thanks, Mo. Thanks for being here. I enjoyed the conversation. It was awesome.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next time on The Conversation, the podcast.